Hey guys, welcome to Ask Truth Apologetics. We are here to keep journeying into the Bible to see if we can't find the great Arabian prophet Muhammad in there. On our last couple of videos, we were searching for him in Isaiah 42. I feel like we have successfully debunked that. And in fact, probably the easiest thing we could have done to debunk that is to quote the Quran. Okay, so the Quran says in chapter 7, verses 157, that those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and gospel, who enjoins upon them what is right and forbids them what is wrong, and makes lawful for them the good things and prohibits for them the evil, and relieves them of their burden and the shackles which were upon them. So they who have believed in him, honored him, supported him, and followed the light which was set down with him. It is those who will be the successful. Right? So, according to the Quran's own criteria, we need to find the unlettered prophet written about in the Torah and the Gospels. Fun fact of the day, Isaiah is not in the Torah. Okay, so for those of you who might not know what the Torah is also known as the Pentateuch, as in pentagon, which is five-sided object. So they are the first 5 books in the Old Testament. So you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? So those 5 books are known as the Torah, and they are traditionally attributed to Moses as the one who had written them. All right, so since we debunked the Isaiah 42 stuff, I've been getting a lot of messages saying that, well, you can read about this unlettered prophet in Deuteronomy 18:18. So what I find interesting about this is I don't see, nowhere in the Bible do I see any sort of unlettered or illiterate prophet mentioned at all in the, especially in the Torah, not in the Gospels either. So right there, it should probably rule out the criteria. Unless it says unlettered prophet, it will pretty much rule out the possibility of it being Muhammad. Another thing that I find interesting about them using Deuteronomy 18, and especially from the chapter that they quote from in the Quran, it says that we, as in the Christians and the Jews, will find written in what we have of the Torah and the Gospel, right? So by implication, that's actually affirming that what the Jews and the Christians had at the time of Muhammad, which was 610, 620, and a little bit beyond AD. The Quran is essentially affirming that those books are reliable, and we do have copies of the Bible from those times which match up perfectly with the Bible that we have today. And yet Muslims like to say that our book has been corrupted. It just seems strange to me that Allah would say you can find Muhammad written about in your book, but your book's corrupted at the same time. It just doesn't make much sense to me, but that's actually not the point of this video. So we will move on, and we will just kind of jump right in to Deuteronomy 18:18, right? So keep in mind what the Muslim narrative is and why they think it is Muhammad, right? So we're going to look into their claims, and guess what? Spoiler alert, we're going to debunk them, right? So Deuteronomy 18:18 goes a little bit something like this. It says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command them. Okay, so right away you can actually tell that you're going to have questions, right? If you just take this verse out of context, when it says things like, I will raise up for them, you have to ask the question, right? Because the context of the chapter will tell you who I is. Who's the I that's speaking? Well, that's Yahweh, that's God. Will raise up for them. So we have to ask, who is them? Well, in the context of it, them is Israel, and a prophet like me, or a prophet like you, right? So in this particular circumstance, who is God calling you? Well, God is calling you Moses. Moses is the one whom God is speaking to. Okay, so I will grant that if we read this verse in isolation, and specifically in the English language, it can leave the door open for some interesting interpretations, right? So the Muslim argument is that a prophet like Moses will come from among the brothers of Israel. All right, so that does actually leave us open for, well, who are the brothers of Israel? Blah, 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 right? So in Deuteronomy 23:7, which some of my Muslim friends like to say, the nation of Edom, or the Edomites, are called explicitly Israel's brothers. Okay, so now we can start to think that perhaps, since we don't have any context to this verse yet, perhaps, especially if we're reading it under the context of chapter 23, that it could be speaking about a prophet that might come from the nation of Edom, or the Edomites. All right, so another problem that Muslims are going to run into is that Edom is not where they claim, the Edomites are not where they claim that Muhammad is descended from. They claim that Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael. So if you know your Bible history, Ishmael was born to Abraham, and the brother of Ishmael was Isaac. Ishmael is cast out into the wilderness with his mother Hagar, while Isaac stays at home with his mother Sarah and Abraham. And God promises that his blessing will go through Isaac and not through Ishmael. Okay, so he makes Ishmael a great nation and things like that, but he says explicitly, God says explicitly in the book of Genesis that he is going to bless the line of Isaac. Okay, so Isaac gives birth to two sons. They're twins. One's name is Esau. Actually, he doesn't give birth, but his wife gives birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. Okay, so the blessing that was passed from Abraham to Isaac is then passed from Isaac to Jacob. Jacob wrestles with God and is later called Israel, where he has 12 sons, where the 12 tribes of Israel come into play. And Esau is essentially cast out kind of in the same way that Ishmael is cast out, and he becomes his own nation, which is in northern Arabia. So this is where the Muslims are going to draw the conclusion that since Muhammad is Arabian, that the Edomites are also Arabian. And so this is basically saying that the prophet like Moses will come from an Arabian place. It's a little bit of a stretch, I think, or it's a lot of bit of a stretch. And I think the best case that the Muslims would have is if they could actually link Muhammad to the Edomites, since the chapter 23 mentions nothing about the Ishmaelites. Okay? So for the Muslim argument to hold up, we actually have to grant them a couple of things. So one of those things is that Muhammad, who claims to be an Ishmaelite, is somehow he needs to be included in the Edomites, okay, which I don't think they make that claim. And then the other thing we have to grant is that chapter 18:18 is actually speaking about a nation outside of Israel, right? So we have to rule out even the possibility that it's talking about Israel. And that namely that nation, with the argument that they've brought forth, is that nation would have to be Edom. Okay, so the other things that we're going to have to do in order to grant this is we have to start to ignore a few things as well. So what we'll have to ignore is the context surrounding chapter 18, verse 18. We'll actually need to ignore the original Hebrew language and only use the translation language of English in order to make this work for the Mohammedans. And because we're going to examine those two criteria, we can confidently rule out any possibility that God is speaking about any prophet outside of Israel. All right. So first, let's look at the context of Deuteronomy 18:18, which actually starts a few verses earlier in verse 15. So it goes like this. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen, just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command to them. So you can see, if you take 18:18 completely out of context, you can start to have questions about who's this, who's that. But when you put it into context, you know who's speaking, you know who they're speaking about, and you know that he's speaking about the nation of Israel and not any nation outside of that, right? But just we can actually go a little bit outside the context, and we can actually start to look into the Hebrew language, since that is the original language that the Old Testament is written in. All right, so here's the first words that we're going to want to look into, and the first word is, and I'm going to butcher how this is pronounced in the Hebrew, so I apologize to any of you Hebrew speakers, which is mikquebeka. Okay, so I apologize. I'll put this up on the screen so you can see what it is that we're talking about. But that word is translated in the ESV translation, which is the one I typically use. It's translated into from among you. Okay, so when we read from among you, it is that word mikquebeka, okay, which is from the root word kereb. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that as well. So what does the root word kereb mean? What does mikquebeka mean? It's literally translated. So when you go and you translate this word, it's literally translated as inward part. So something that is inside or within a part. Or another word for it in that same definition is midst. Okay. So when it says from among you, you have to apply from your inward part. So if he's speaking to the nation of Israel, then that means that your inward part, from within your midst, right? So the Lord your God will raise up from you. So if we're going to translate it like this, it would go, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from in your midst. Okay, in your midst, within this particular congregation. All right, so this is the first clue that we need to put 18:18 into its proper context. And midst, I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and defines the word midst as interior or central part or point. Okay, so Merriam-Webster gives this example. It says, in the midst of the forest, right? So if you're applying that to in the midst of the Israelites, you're not going to be thinking outside of that forest, right? Not this forest and a forest over here, inside that midst over there. No, we're talking about the brothers of within this forest, the inward parts of this nation is what we're talking about. Okay, so this is obviously not speaking about the Edomites. This is not speaking about any nation outside of the Israelites. Okay, this is only speaking about the Israelite nation. Okay, so we understand that the prophet must come from the Israelites, right? So Moses is addressing in context the Israelites exclusively here. So the prophet can only be from within their midst, only within their midst. If does that mean that anyone can come from anywhere outside of the Israelites? No, only, exclusive, within your midst. Okay, so the Hebrew root word kereb is used in verse 15 as well as verse 18, right? So this should be enough to convince any logical human being that a prophet like Moses can only be an Israelite. But we're not talking about logical human beings. We're talking about people who have an agenda, specifically in this case, the Muslim agenda, where they're trying to prove that their Quran is not incorrect. They're trying to prove that Muhammad, the unlettered prophet, is somehow found in the Torah. Okay? So they're not going to accept this, but we can actually do better. We can convince them even further. So remember when I said that they believe that Edom is considered a brother of Israel and that the prophet can be from them, right? And so let's put this into context. Let's actually read that verse in chapter 23, verse 7, where it says that about the Edomites. And so it says here in verse 7, chapter 23, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother." Okay, so see, same word, brother, brother. So we shall not abhor an Egyptian because you were a sojourner in his land. Okay, so when we read the English, we see two words that are the same. We see brother in 18:18 and 18:15. We also see brother here in Deuteronomy 23:7. So out of context and only in the English language, without putting the Hebrew word for midst in there, which, by the way, the Hebrew word midst is not found anywhere in chapter 23. So now we're going to actually start to look at what the Hebrew word for brother is. Okay, so in English, brother can apply to many, many different things. So I can use it in a literal sense, like, hey, my brother, who is the child of my father and my mother, my literal flesh and blood brother. I can use it in a relatively broad sense to say something along the lines of, hey, this is my brother in humanity, right? That can mean that he's anywhere in the world. The only thing that I can tell is he's masculine, right, because it's brother, and that he's a human. Okay, so the word brother in English can be used in that sense. It can also be used in a little bit more of a specific sense to say, my American brother, right? So it's still pretty broad, but we're putting it down into a nation. And I can also use it as someone who's my friend, right? Like, hey, this is such and such name. He's my brother, right? He's not my physical flesh and blood brother, but he's very close to me. He's someone whom I might treat as a brother, but who is not literally a brother. Or I can say that, this is my Christian brother or my Muslim brother or something like that. So we can use that to indicate that they are a part of some group that we are a part of, right? So since we understand that the word brother, the term brother, can mean a lot of different things, can it also mean a lot of different things in the Hebrew? Or are there actually differences in the way that the Hebrew is spoken? And how that these things come to be, right? So in the English term brother, it could potentially mean the Edomites, but given the context, it's very, very obvious that it's not the Edomites, and it's not what we're talking about in chapter 15 or 18, verses 15 and 18. So yes, you can twist and contort and distort the English translation to maybe slightly possibly support the notion that Muhammad is even remotely potentially a candidate for this prophet like Moses, which obviously he isn't. But you can kind of almost get there when you only use the English and you completely ignore context and you completely ignore the Hebrew language and how the Hebrew language works. But luckily for us, we can even put the nail in the coffin further because the word brother, the term brother, is used in a different way here, right? So it is used, there are differences in the word brother that is used. All right, so I'm going to show you up on your screen the Hebrew that is used, the Hebrew word used in 18:18. So check that out, see what that looks like. So whereas the Hebrew word used in 23:7, so go ahead and look at that on your screen, okay? And now we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of those words. We're going to play a really, really easy, fun game. We should have all learned this in preschool. It's called, Are These Two Things the Same? Okay, so if you have any sense about you, you will immediately look at that and observe it. You don't have to speak Hebrew, understand Hebrew, to look at it and go, you know what, those two things are different. These are different things. Okay, so they're obviously not the same word. Now, they may come from the same root word, which we'll get into, but the Hebrew is going to use them in a very specific way. So whereas the English, we're kind of limited. Brother can mean whatever, and we have to determine these things and how they're used in context. But actually in the Hebrew, we don't have to know that much of the context, and we can just follow what the word is and how it is written. Okay, so I am not a Hebrew language expert, so what I have to do is I have to research this on my own. So I just did a word search in Bible Hub. So I followed the word used in brother for 1818. I saw how it was used in the context of all the other places that it was used in the Bible. I did the same thing for Deuteronomy 23:7. I did a word search to see when it was used in all of its context, and I determined that they contextually do not mean the same thing. So to confirm what I understand, I reached out to my Hebrew language expert friend to affirm and to educate me on the topic. All right, and this is what they said. Right, so the word used in 1818, which you'll see right here on your screen, they said, this is your brothers. It is in the plural form, and this means a brother from within the community or family only, and it cannot be used for outsiders. So the word used in Deuteronomy 18:18 is this word, okay, in the Hebrew, and it means a brother within your community or family only. Exclusively. Okay, this means that it cannot be from an outsider. Okay, so Israel is the nation in which the midst of them God was speaking, or Moses was delivering God's message to. When he says the word that's translated as brothers, he means in the Hebrew, which they would have understood, that it is someone in your midst who is specifically a community member, okay, not someone outside of the Israelites. When we go to chapter 23, verse 7, we see this word used, okay? And so, yes, it also means your brother. It's in a singular form, right? So this form is much more loose, where it can be used for anyone. So it can be used for someone within your community, but it can also be used for someone outside of the community. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? So the Hebrew language used in chapter 18:18 is exclusive to Israel. It's exclusive in the sense that it can only mean the Israelites and cannot mean anyone outside of Israel. Okay, so let's just do a real quick thing. Is Muhammad Jewish? Say no. Muhammad is not Jewish, okay? So if Muhammad is not Jewish and he's not from within the nation of Israel, can he possibly be the prophet who this is speaking about? No, cannot be, okay? And just to confirm this, okay, so when we talk about the word used in chapter 23, verse 17, it's a loose term that can be used for anyone, and it makes sense that it's used in the specific context of that situation, because they're speaking about Edomites, they're speaking about Ammonites, they're speaking about Egyptians and things like that. So they're talking about people outside of the nation of Israel. So at the end of the day, guys, I'm not making any assertions at this time about who the prophet like Moses is. Okay, that's not the point of this. I just wanted to rule out the possibility that the prophet like Moses could potentially be Muhammad. It's obviously not Muhammad. Anyone who thinks so, after seeing all this, and go ahead and do your research on it. When you do your research, you'll come to the same conclusion of which I have come to. So if you continue to say that this is about Muhammad, you are now knowingly lying and are knowingly being a deceiver. Okay, do not be among the deceivers, and do not follow someone who is the best of deceivers, if you know what I mean. Okay, so thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a fantastic day, and you need to know something really important. Jesus loves you. Have a good one.